You ever wondered if Jesus really existed? Today, you're going to discover evidence so strong it will change the way you think forever. And the last one will surprise you.
7 reasons you should believe in Jesus, even if you don't. So what if you're not a believer? What if the whole story of Jesus feels a little much for our modern scientific world? Let's be real. Most people who don't believe have good, logical reasons for their skepticism. We're taught to trust what we can see, measure, and prove. A man who supposedly walked on water, healed the blind, and came back from the dead doesn't exactly fit into that box. But what if there are equally compelling, historically grounded reasons to take a second look that often get missed? What if the evidence for this one man's life is actually better than for many historical figures we don't think twice about? In this video, we're not talking about blind faith. We're not going to ask you to check your brain at the door. We're doing the opposite. We're going to investigate 7 pieces of evidence from ancient non-Christian historians to powerful philosophical arguments that have convinced skeptics and scholars for centuries. We're treating this like a historical case and weighing the evidence as it comes. So, let's get into it. The mountain of non-Christian evidence. First up, and this might be the most startling reason, Jesus' existence isn't just documented in the Bible. It's confirmed by hostile and neutral sources outside of it. Skeptics often ask, of course, the Bible says Jesus existed, but where's the outside proof? It's a fair question. And the proof is there, written by people who weren't Christians and had zero reason to promote the faith. Let's start with a key reference to Jesus from a man named Cornelius Tacitus, a respected Roman senator and historian born around 56 AD. In his work, The Annals, he describes Emperor Nero persecuting Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. He writes, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Let's unpack that. A premier Roman historian who called Christianity a mischievous superstition is reporting on what these early Christians believed. He confirms the core of their story, that their founder, Christus, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. This isn't a believer writing. This is an enemy of the church documenting historical facts about the origins of this movement. But he's not the only one. Josephus, a 1st century Romano-Jewish historian, also mentions Jesus. In one passage, he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. In another, more controversial passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, he describes Jesus. While most scholars agree this section was likely authored by later Christian scribes, many believe it originally contained an authentic core reference to Jesus as a wise man with many followers who was crucified by Pilate. Together, these sources paint a clear picture. Jesus was a real, historical figure who was crucified. The sources are shockingly early. Another common skeptical argument is that the stories about Jesus were written so long after he died that they became distorted, like a game of historical telephone. That seems reasonable until you actually look at the dates. The Gospels and other New Testament writings are some of the best preserved and earliest attested documents from the ancient world. Most scholars date the Gospels as being written within a few decades of the events they describe, placing Mark around 70 AD and Matthew and Luke in the following years. To put that in perspective, the 2 most famous biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch more than 400 years after Alexander died, yet historians consider them largely reliable. The Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. But we can get even earlier. The letters of the Apostle Paul are dated even closer to Jesus' life, with his earliest letters written within just 25 to 30 years of Jesus' death. Even more compelling, within his letter to the Corinthians, Paul quotes an early Christian creed, a formal statement of belief about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Scholars believe this creed dates back to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. This means the core beliefs about Jesus, that he died and rose again, weren't late-stage inventions. They were circulating almost immediately, at a time when hundreds of eyewitnesses could have easily debunked them. The Gospels get the details, right? if the gospel writers were just making up a story, you'd expect them to get the little details of the time and place wrong. It would be like someone today writing a novel set in the 1852nd and having characters use iPhones. The small mistakes give it away. But when it comes to the Gospels, historians are often impressed by their accuracy. The writers show an intimate knowledge of first century Palestinian geography, customs, and politics. They correctly name rulers like Herod and Pilate, describe real places like the Pool of Bethesda with its 5 porticos, a detail long thought to be an invention until archaeology confirmed its existence and referenced local social customs and religious debates with a precision that suggests first-hand knowledge. Even the names mentioned, Simon, Joseph, Mary, James, are consistent with what we now know were the most common Jewish names in that region at that time, based on independent archaeological finds. This contextual accuracy doesn't prove the miracles, but it shows the Gospels aren't fairy tales. They are grounded in a real time and place, written by people who knew the world they were describing. We're about halfway through, and we've established that non-Christian historians confirm Jesus' existence. The accounts were written remarkably early, and they're grounded in verifiable historical detail. If you're finding this evidence-based approach interesting, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We're about to shift from the historical to the philosophical, and you won't want to miss it. The disciples died for what? This brings us to our fourth and perhaps most powerful philosophical reason: the transformation of Jesus' followers. Think about it. People might die for what they believe is true, but they won't die for what they know is a lie. After Jesus was crucified, his followers were scattered, terrified, and crushed. Their leader was dead. In the Jewish mindset of the time, a crucified Messiah was a failed Messiah. Yet, something happened that transformed this defeated group into a world-changing movement. They claimed they saw Jesus alive again, and they didn't just claim it, they staked their lives on it. Strong Christian tradition holds that many of the apostles were martyred. For figures like Peter and Paul, the tradition of their martyrdom is particularly strong. They faced persecution, torture, and death, yet were unwavering. If the resurrection was a story they had invented, they would have known it was a fraud. Under threat of a gruesome death, wouldn't at least one of them have cracked to save themselves? Their willingness to suffer and die is a powerful testament that they genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus. The story was too implausible to be invented. If you were going to invent a Messiah figure in the first century, you would never invent someone like Jesus. The Jewish expectation was for a mighty political leader, a warrior king like David who would overthrow the oppressive Roman regime. They wanted a conqueror. What they got in the story of Jesus was the opposite: a humble carpenter who taught about loving your enemies. His crowning achievement wasn't a military victory, but a humiliating execution reserved for the worst criminals. A dying and rising Messiah was a concept completely foreign, even offensive to first century Jewish belief. Then there are the embarrassing details. The Gospels report that the first witnesses to the empty tomb were women. In first century Jewish and Roman society, a woman's testimony carried very little legal weight. If you were fabricating a story to be persuasive, you would make the first witnesses credible men. The fact that the Gospels include these counterintuitive details strongly suggests the writers were recording what actually happened, no matter how inconvenient. The story is full of these kinds of details that no one would invent if they were trying to create a convincing lie. It's the principle of multiple attestation. In historical research, there's a principle called the criterion of multiple attestation. The idea is simple. If an event or saying is reported in multiple independent sources, it's more likely to be authentic. When we apply this to the life of Jesus, the results are stunning. We don't just have one biography of Jesus, we have 4 in the Gospels, plus additional details in Paul's letters and other New Testament writings. While Matthew, Mark, and Luke share material, they also have unique content, and the Gospel of John is vastly different. This gives us multiple lines of testimony to the core events of Jesus' life. Key facts like his baptism, his ministry of teaching and performing wonders, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the discovery of his empty tomb are attested in several of these independent sources. This is exactly what historians look for when trying to verify a person or event from the ancient world. It moves the life of Jesus out of the category of myth and firmly into the category of history. The unparalleled impact of his teachings. Finally, even if you set aside the miracles and the resurrection, there's the undeniable power of Jesus' teachings. His message, centered on radical love, forgiveness, and the dignity of every single human being, was revolutionary. In a world defined by power and strict social hierarchies, Jesus taught that the poor were blessed and the last would be first. He introduced concepts of universal love and mercy that became a foundational pillar of Western ethics and human rights. Think of the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the command to love your neighbor as yourself. These ideas weren't just abstract philosophies. They created a new way of seeing the world. The teachings of Jesus have inspired countless individuals, from social reformers like Martin Luther King Jr. to humanitarians across the globe. The moral beauty and transformative power of these teachings demand to be taken seriously. Where did a carpenter from a remote corner of the Roman Empire get a philosophy that would reshape human history? The world-altering impact of his ideas is in itself a piece of evidence that demands an explanation.